One stands out was when I was flying out of Saudi Arabia, and we had a new thing called GPS, brand new thing. Matter of fact, the ops manual was basically all we had, the GPS, brand new. So I had to learn that in the field. And on top of that, I was performing the operational test and evaluation of a new 1034 pressure suit, a blue one. So I had a little bit of juggles and things I was busy thinking about in the air. So I launched on my first mission, and I drew an olive branch mission. And it was an hour and a half to get to Iraq. You know, I got over Baghdad, then I went up to Mosul, and then I think I came back. This was basically a 7-hour mission. And when I was coming back through Baghdad, my defensive system lit up like a Christmas tree. And no, the defensive system was not upgraded. I was only able to determine that it was hostile. They had a hostile intent. I could tell that the fins on the SA-2s were moving. And so I wouldn't know if there was a launch or not. All I know is the fins on the SA-2 were moving, and my defensive systems could not defeat it. So that was an automatic abort. So I got the heck out of Dodge. I had to maneuver, anticipating that there was a launch. We had certain techniques and procedures we would follow to try to avoid a threat like that. And I do emphasize try, because that's a very tricky maneuver. The cloud cover was there. I could not see where the launch would come from, so I couldn't see if it was launched or not. I just got the heck out of there. I lost about 5,000 to 8,000 feet at altitude, and I was yanking and banking to maneuver the airplane. And in my yanking and banking, I discovered as I crossed the border into Saudi Arabia that my hydraulic systems were failing. And of course, what that meant I was going to wind up having to do a no-flap landing. And so remember when I talked in the beginning, the no-flap landings were very tricky. I had a scuddy, a haze cloud deck below. I made it back to Taif, Saudi Arabia. And what I found when I was about 25 minutes out, as luck would have it, there was an accident on the Saudi flight line. A truck had run over their TACAN and ILS system. So the instrument landing system and the TACAN for navigation was out. Those were the navigation aids I was planning on using to land. And so I had to rely on this newfangled thing called the GPS. Matter of fact, it was so new, there weren't out any approach plates for a GPS. Those are procedures that you would follow to bring an airplane in to land for a specific airport. And there are a variety of them. The instrument landing system, the TACAN system. But since those systems were out, this ILS system did not have a planned approach plate. So I had to invent one. And what I did was I knew that waypoint, 0 was the center of a field. And I looked at the TACAN approach, which was a teardrop, which was almost the center of a field. And so what I decided to do was to run a TACAN approach using the GPS, highly illegal, by the way, using the GPS coordinate. And that worked out fine. And I was able to land it, got it on the ground. And of course, the guys came out and pulled me out of there. And I was thankful to get back. The no-flap landing, that was tricky, but I managed to get down.
So what is the training involved to learn how to fly a U-2? You're already a pilot with a lot of hours. Is it all specific to that aircraft at this point?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And the training is pretty involved. It generally takes 4 to 6 months. Really depends on how the specialization that you wind up going through. But I'll walk you through some of the first part of it. And fortunately, I read Tony LeVere's notes. Now, who's Tony LeVere? Tony LeVere was the test pilot in 1955 for the first U-2. And he developed the landing technique to land the U-2. And I read his notes, and he had problems. You see, it was August the 1st of 1955 when he was scheduled for a taxi test at Groom Lake, which he and Kelly Johnson picked out in Nevada, which is known as Area 51. And when he brought it around, when he went out to taxi and he brought it around to the runway to go up to, 60 knots or so, 65 knots, he became airborne. He did not expect that. And he had one heck of a time getting it back on the ground. He wrestled it to the ground, and he broke the strut, I think, on the main gear, which is the one up front. It's basically a bicycle landing gear configuration, and he developed a technique. You need to stall it to land it from 2 feet. So it was at that point. So I'm writing his notes, and what he did was, if I remember it right, is once he got his seat adjusted properly in the U-2, he put strips of tape or some kind of a mark where the horizon cut through the canopy. And that was the position or the view he would see when the airplane was in the proper position. So I remember that. And so when I am going on my interview flight, and when they interview you, that's 2 weeks long, and you get academics, brief academics, you get a briefing, and then we got a ride in a two-seater, but the guy in the back, the instructor, he didn't say anything. He expected you to get in it, flip the switches right, taxi it out there, take off, and bring it around and land it 3 ways. You had to land it normally, you had to land it no flap, and you had to land it without a voice. This is for the interview flight. So normally it's tough enough because you got to bring it around and get it down to 2 feet and stall it to land it. No flap, it gets kind of tricky. You have to be so precise on speed that we cross the threshold of the runway at about 10 foot, bring it down to 2 foot, and you have to be on speed for every knot you're above speed for a no flap. You're going to extend the run 1,000 feet, and you'll eat up runway really quick. So you have to do that through precise airspeed control. And you got to do that for the interview. And then, of course, you got to bring one around, and you got to land it without a voice, meaning as a margin of safety, we have another pilot in a chase car that chases the U-2 that's coming in for a landing to call out altitudes and degrees of crab.
And you don't get that on that last landing?
No.
No help from the ground?
Now think about this, though. Normally for a mission, a U-2 mission might last 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours. And in that environment, the person who is flying the airplane might lose 4.5 pounds of weight through perspiration and respiration.
Yeah.
And gosh, he's a lump of jello by the time he's brought back. And when he gets it in the position to land it, he couldn't pass a physical. That's why that extra pilot is back there calling out his speed and altitude as margin of safety.
What makes the U-2 so difficult to fly? It's got a huge wingspan. You would think it's got a lot of lift, like a glider. It would be simple, but it's not. What makes it difficult?
Well, you just described it all, except it's not simple.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things about it that are simple. It's a single engine, right? But the handling characteristics of the U-2 down low in thick air are much different than the handling characteristics up at altitude. Mm-hmm. At altitude, the air is very thin. Pressure-wise, the difference between sea level and at altitude, sea level, you're feeling 14.7 pounds per square inch on your body, and up at altitude, it's less than 0.5 pound. So the air is very thin. And so the airplane tends to maneuver better at altitude. But you still have to be careful because of the stall speed. It's plus or minus 5 knots. Yeah. So if you go too fast, the airplane could come apart. If you go too slow, it'll come out of the sky.
So the aircraft is designed to fly at altitude. So when you get to sea level and try to land it,
it's rough. It's a handful.
Yeah.
It's a workout. It's a wrestling match.
Who are you looking for to fly those? What's the Air Force is looking for a certain type of pilot?
Well, the first thing we look for is a volunteer to do that kind of flying. and to fly to some of these locations. And this type of flying isn't for everybody. And sometimes we weed them out in the interview too. One of the things that you might not think about is we actually put the pressure suit, the spacesuit, on them and put them in an altitude chamber. And we show them the differential being the pressure differential when things tend to expand and contract, bubbles or balloons bursting in at the altitude chamber. The other thing that we look for is the person claustrophobic. Because if you have any bit of claustrophobia, the wearing a spacesuit just won't work.
Do you recall your first time flying solo?
Oh, it was exhilarating.
Yeah.
But I was, I had my feelings of apprehension, but once I got the hang of it, I was feeling pretty good about it.
Yeah. No issues, I'm assuming.
The thing about the airplane, though, is once one started feeling comfortable, that's when the airplane could bite you. So you in the U-2, you don't ever want to get complacent because something will cause you to get your attention or scare you.
Yeah. How long in advance do you find out you have a mission? What's typical?
Well, they have to give us the crew rest because, and they pay a lot of attention to the crew rest for a U-2 pilot because he's going to be out there by himself.
Yeah.
And he may be over territory that is hostile to him. Iraq is a good example. And so we would be trained to watch our diets, first of all, at least 24 hours out. And then we would go into crew rest. We needed at least about 12 hours of crew rest, 8 hours of sleep. And some locations, they gave us, at that time, Restoril, which would be a narcotic that would put us to sleep, and we would be out for 8 hours. Because sometimes we'd have to, hit the sack at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and we needed a good night's sleep, good night's rest before the mission. I might also say that before each mission, each pilot has to have a physical. So a flight surgeon comes in, gives us a physical, and if we've got so much as a runny nose, then the backup pilot, which we've identified, fills in.
So you know in advance you're going to go on a mission.
Right.
So the day of the mission, walk us through the procedure.
Well, we would,
Typical.
going back to mission planning.
Yeah.
When they identify it, we'd have a mission planner who would review the mission with us.
Okay.
He prepared the map boards. We would carry, our maps were mounted on cardboard because wearing a spacesuit, we don't really have much dexterity. So the map boards would be put together by the planner, and he would walk us through where we were going, what we were going to be doing, what to expect, where our divert fields are, if something goes wrong, if you have an engine failure or hydraulic failure or something like that. And we would spend a couple hours in mission planning before we'd go into crew rest.
So the day of the mission, you wake up and then...
Wake up, we report in at 2 hours and 15 minutes prior. And in those days, and I know they do things a little different now, but in those days, they were still big on the meals. And so 2 hours and 15 minutes prior, we would go get our weather brief. Weather, particularly for a U-2 pilot, is very, very, any pilot worries about the weather.
Yeah.
But for a U-2 pilot, we didn't have weather radar or anything like that. And we had a lot of things on our mind, a lot of equipment to work with, and a handful of airplane to fly. So we wanted to make sure that we were in the best of weather. So we go to weather, get our weather brief, and then we would go to the kitchen and we would be prepared a high protein meal. High protein meal would be steak, eggs, no carbs, and that's so the stuff could sit with us. It's high protein, low residue. The thing that comes to mind is, that's why we start on it 24 hours prior. At those altitudes and the pressure differentials, if we would eat cabbage, beans, or onions, it would be very explosive in the GI tract.
Right.
And, we could have one, be very painful and get sick, or wind up defecating in the suit, which is a big no-no.
Yeah. So you don't want any gas or bloating or anything like that. When you get
Painful.
to altitude, it makes it worse.
It could destroy a mission.
So you get in the aircraft the day of the mission, and everything is timed, correct?
Yes.
You said 2 hours and 15 minutes.
So what?
the next-
After breakfast, we go for the flight physical. Doc comes in, ear, nose, and throat, temperature, blood pressure, and anything out of whack, we're grounded. The next guy comes in, who's been prepared to back up. Then after the flight physical, we get dressed. We wind up putting on long underwear and what's called a urine collection device. It looks like a prophylactic, the thickness of a rubber band, and it fits through the long underwear and it hangs down and it's attached to our private parts.
Yeah.
And that's so we could urinate. And then we would go out to the physiological support division technicians and they would help us get into the pressure suit. We would crawl into it from the back and they'd help us get it on. They'd zip us up. Then they'd put our harness, which is a life harness, zip us up. We'd sit in a reclining chair and they'd start testing our equipment. They'd test our communications line. They'd test our oxygen lines to make sure that we were getting oxygen. They would test basically all of our connections. And then we'd have to sit there for an hour to an hour and a half and pre-breathe 100% oxygen for an hour to an hour and a half prior to takeoff. And that's to get the nitrogen out of the bloodstreams, because we don't want to get the bends at altitude, because it's a lot, sort of like being in reverse when you're deep sea diving. So we're very careful about pressure differential.
Yeah.
And then after that pre-breathe, the technicians come in and get us, and they help us out to a van, which also has a recliner in it, take us out to the airplane. And then they help us carrying our oxygen equipment and our air conditioning pack. And we climb upstairs and get into the cockpit. And then we really rely on them to hook up all of our connections, our communications lines, our air vents, our hoses, our oxygen. And that's because we don't have the dexterity to do it in a pressure suit. So they hook it all up, they test everything in the airplane, and then we run through our pre-takeoff checklist. Now, while the mission pilot is going through his physical and suiting up, the backup pilot, he's out pre-flighting the airplane. Normally a pilot pre-flights his own airplane, but in the U-2, the backup pilot does the pre-flight of the airplane.
Right, because you're in a pressure suit, and it's just. And
so the airplane is ready to start when he gets into the cockpit.
Yeah.
The pilot.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like it's almost identical to the process for an astronaut getting into the space shuttle.
Well, it's very close to the SR-71 too.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's all pretty much the same. You're almost an astronaut in a way. How long is a typical mission?
Depends on what part of the world. 9 to 12 hours.
Yeah.
The ones that were going up to Afghanistan were about 11, 12 hours long. Long.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're flying over Afghanistan, correct? You're violating their airspace, essentially.
That's correct.
Yeah. But you would not do that for the Soviet Union or Russia.
We offset. We would not overfly the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And we never did overfly the Soviet Union purposefully after May Day 1960.
Yeah.
And that was true for the SR-71 too. Only lateral missions.
Yeah. And you could see far enough in, I guess, that you could accomplish the goal.
Far enough in, 300, 350 miles, depending upon the altitude.
What are you doing in the U-2? What tasks do you have to complete when you're flying? You're not just a pilot. You have other stuff to do as well, correct?
Yeah, it's a multitude of tasks. The U-2 pilot is a pretty busy person.
Yeah.
Pretty busy. He's not only responsible for flying the airplane, and that's why if the autopilot breaks, it's an abort, because during the mission, the autopilot is flying the airplane. But if something screws up with the autopilot, it's technically an abort.
Yeah.
But the U-2 pilot is looking at his plan that he's rehearsed when he was pre-breathing. I didn't mention that during the pre-breathe, the U-2 pilot is chair flying the mission. He's just thinking through that entire mission while he's sitting there pre-breathing. And so he's putting it into practice once he's flying. And it's a whole handful of airplane just to get it airborne. Taxiing the airplane is even difficult. Why? Well, again, tandem gear, bicycle gear, and the tail gear is the steering gear. And the tail gear only turns 6.5 degrees, or 3.5 degrees left, right, or center. And what that translates to is the airplane turning away from the wind. The turn radius is about 300 feet. And then turning into the wind, that's a little sharper, the turn radius is about 140, 150 feet. So not every airport traffic area diagram accommodates a U-2. Sometimes the U-2s have got to be pre-positioned at the end of the runway because they can't turn on the taxiways. So even when the U-2 pilot is pulling out of the chocks, he's got to taxi very slowly, very carefully. So and once he gets to the launch point and he's cleared to launch, so what happens is the ground crews come out and there are outrigger gear that are attached to each wing. And these outrigger gear enable the U-2 to taxi. The ground crews remove the pins from the outrigger gear and upon takeoff, and once the pilot is cleared for takeoff, as soon as the wings start generating lift, the outrigger gear drop from the wing, and the airplane, lightweight, can just about stand on its tail. And that's one of the things that I noticed in my interview flight, which was a mistake, by the way. What was the mistake? On my interview flight, once we launched, that airplane just about stood on its tail and the altimeter was just spinning around, and I fixated on the altimeter and I almost let my airspeed get away from me. So that's one of the things that impressed me on my very first interview flight.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky thing, taking off, getting up to altitude, and then you set up for the mission. You run your checklist. It takes time to run the checklist. You look at your mission, and then you know where you're going to go in, where you're going to go out, what equipment you're going to run, how you're going to run it. If you got a camera on board, which way you're going to point it. If you got it, they have an electrical optical camera in the nose. That's pretty much automatic, controlled from the ground site. And they also have SIG-IN equipment, which they do a lot of listening. So there's a lot of things that the U-2 is doing that keeps that pilot occupied.
Yeah.
He's a busy person.
Yeah.
The early guys, they had one additional thing to do. They had to navigate by sextant. So not only were they flying and running the mission equipment on a tough airplane, but they were navigating using the sextant.
Yeah.
To get to where they were going.
Yeah. Incredible. There's a lot to do, a lot to think about, a lot of multitasking going on.
And that's why generally that we like it, because it was so hard.
Yeah. Yeah, you had to fly the airplane.
Stick and rudder.
Stick and rudder. Imagine the aircraft they fly now is completely different than what Gary Powers would have flown. Even though it's a U-2, it's different.
The first model was the A model.
Yeah.
And the differential there was it flew with a J57 engine. Then came the C model. That came with the J75 engine, a little more powerful engine. Okay. And that model airplane was a bit smaller. It had about 80 foot of wingspan and, maybe 40 foot of fuselage. And then there was the R model, which got to 104 foot of wingspan, 60 foot of fuselage. The R model laid out was almost the length and width of a B-17. So it was quite a bit, it handled a little bit differently than the C model.
Yeah.
The C model, you could get into trouble real quick and you could get out of it quick too, meaning getting into a stall or something like that. And but the R model might have been a little bit slower to get into trouble, but it took a little longer to get out of trouble. So no matter which type of airplane you were in, you really had to be cognizant of flying that airplane.
Right.
Because the Dragon Lady can bite you.
What advice would you give somebody that might watch this interview who's considering a career in the military? What would you tell them?
Go for it. There's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah. You know,
I don't regret a minute that I was in the military. I had a lot of disappointments. You know, remember I was telling you about the disappointment of not getting to go to flight school?
Yep.
Then going up to a radar site in a part of Michigan that was sort of isolated. But looking back on it, I learned a lot, and I have a lot of memorable experiences from that. From there, I went to Edwards to be the commander of a headquarters squadron. And from there, I was selected to pilot training. So it all works out in the long run. Yeah. You just got to keep persistent so you can persevere.
Yeah.